Hey everybody, Eric Chessen, founder of Autism Fitness, leading the movement for movement and bringing you another awesome pro interview in our Autism Fitness Certified Pro interview series. Angela Lombara, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thanks, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We are continuing this series, and what I love about it, what I've found that people absolutely love is to learn about how different pros are implementing the programs in different environments. So, Angela, a little like brief background on how you found Autism Fitness and then kind of your day to day. Like how did you originally see the program working for your learners?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a registered behavior analyst and a
Mhm,
BCBA, so a board certified behavior analyst, as well as certified fitness professional.
mhm,
So years ago, so I've worked in this field for over a decade now,
mhm,
just working with all the way from children all the way up to adults. The last several years, I actually worked in supported living environments where I
mhm,
supported adults with
mhm,
some profound developmental disabilities,
mhm,
and so they lived with us 24/7. So I was able to sort of see sort of like just their day to day, right? And our goal was really to improve the quality of their life, especially when we supported them from a everyday perspective. So um, fitness became something that when I got really involved with fitness, there were certain things that I was noticing from the people that we supported that I was kind of like, oh, it's interesting that, they're struggling and, engaging in some dysregulation behaviors when we're, just everyday tasks, right? Like anything from mopping the floors to helping with laundry or like, standing to help cooking, things like that. We're seeing a lot of dysregulation, even with just little things like that.
mhm,
So I delved a little bit more into fitness personally as well. When I
mhm,
got, got exercising and getting into that a few years ago,
mhm,
and just see how, we talk a lot about in even just like, how fitness is so important for everybody, right? Like that we should be moving and we should be doing all these things. I was quite shocked to see how little some of the people we supported actually did those themselves. So, there wasn't really any structured programming. We would take them on regularly on walks, but there wasn't really anything for them that was very structured that helped develop some of those skills that would later, benefit them sort of to do those everyday tasks that they really needed to do. So that's kind of when I started really looking into, was there anything that I could do in my programming, in developing the behavior support plans that could help improve sort of, just their quality of life in that regard. And
mhm,
that's how I kind of got into it. And I found Autism Fitness and I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly what I needed. And at the time, I wasn't a certified personal trainer yet.
mhm,
So this was, I think, a great intro to how I could bring fitness into sort of their everyday life. And
mhm,
that's how I basically got started. And then it's kind of, the more I did it and I saw the benefits of it, I kind of
mhm,
really loved it. Even more so. So then I got my became a certified fitness professional,
mhm,
just so I could then bring my sort of like, work on this a little further and really focus on it a lot more because initially it was just like a snippet of it in their plan. And now I really look into advocating and really introducing fitness into just, again, their everyday life. So that's a little bit about sort of like the history of how I got into it.
yeah.
And fast forward sort of the last year now, I sort of stepped into it more full time,
Mhm,
where now I'm actually working with a lot of children, which was
mhm,
not my original plan, but it just seems like it's become this thing, not become this thing. I think there's
right.
just been a lot more advocacy and a lot more education with families about
Mhm,
how important this can be. So I work with a lot of children now under 18,
mhm,
and working on developing these skills so that, they can develop these healthy habits early on, and bring sort of movement back into their life. And just building that into their plan so that they can develop a lot of these skills early on. so that it becomes a lot easier when they get older,
Mhm.
because it's such a huge change, right? Like, and
Mhm.
sometimes it takes years for them to develop these skills. So,
Sure.
so I work with mostly children now,
Mhm.
basically.
So
Yeah.
do you find any significant difference when you're implementing a one of our fitness programs for one of your older adults versus, you know, let's say an 11 or 12-year-old kid or adolescent? What are some of the major differences, if any, that you find?
In terms of differences, obviously, I think I find interest, right?
Mhm.
So as you are, the I find with the younger individuals, I work on a little bit of both, where I do some sports specific stuff too,
Mhm.
and I also build in some of their, just the daily activity living stuff.
Yeah.
Just because they're a little bit younger, I use it as an opportunity for them to develop some skills so that they can eventually be able to participate in sports where they can
Mhm.
engage in social interactions, which currently a lot of them, it is a huge barrier for them, like not
Sure.
having the stamina, the endurance, or the strength to be
Mhm.
able to sort of, or the confidence even, right, to
Sure.
participate in sort of those in those, not necessarily sports activities, but even just like any sort of
Right. Like
physical,
interactive physical activity,
yeah, like
like
going to gym
hiking,
class.
biking,
Yeah,
canoeing.
like
Yeah.
or going hiking with their family or going
Sure.
for like a festival where they can, they have to walk for periods of time. Little things where families or and they couldn't participate in because of their lack of, you know, uh physical, I don't know, like their ability, I guess.
Mhm.
Or, just not having the confidence to do that has really limited a lot of their sort of their real world experiences.
Yeah.
So I find my training changes slightly in that regard because their goals are very different, right? So a lot of the training it still applies 100%, but I think how I approach is it a little bit different because each of my families have very different goals as to what they would like, from the programming and training, right? If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the word confidence, which is a big one that it's interesting because for years I didn't necessarily abstain from discussing confidence, but it varies so greatly because our populations vary so greatly from, individuals who are self-advocate, the quintessential athlete that we have who is neurodivergent, who can express themselves extraordinarily well,
Mhm.
to our individuals who need a very high level of support in not only their day-to-day activities, but their communication and their ability to get what they need and want throughout the day. The confidence piece of it is interesting, and I'd love to get your take on it also because it's something that I think, as in the clinical world, we want to define everything and should. Confidence for me for a long time seemed like a fleeting one because how do you necessarily define it? Not only for someone who can't necessarily advocate fluently on their own behalf, but even somebody who can, but what is actually, how do we take confident and break it down into saying that we have a net increase in this individual's confidence with respect to their movement? So how do you approach that conversation?
Yeah, so for me, like it's a lot, and you're absolutely correct, right? Like it's so hard to operationally define
Mm,
confidence because everyone's confidence level looks a little bit different. So for me, fine, I'll just explain from my perspective. So for example, when I work with athletes, when I first meet with them, um, some of them are very hesitant, right? Like there's just a lot of things going on. There's now structure, there's movements that they're not used to, there's instructions that they're not familiar with. Sometimes there's equipment that they've never seen. And just seeing sort of, and just how they kind of move about in session is something that
mm,
I always kind of observe. And every session that I have with them, I've noticed that slight increase, and it doesn't have to be verbal, right? Some of
mm,
my athletes that I work with are not verbal, or are
mhm,
very limited verbal ability.
mhm.
But I sort of measure confidence in regards to how quickly they're able to sort of pick up the dumbbell when the instruction's been given, or how fluidly they're able to move, or, when in baseline, maybe they're just like, it takes them just that much longer to to start the exercise. But once they're able to know what they need, what the expectation is, they're able to get going right away, right?
Mhm.
Just the latency of how quickly they can follow instructions. There's sometimes it's even just when they finish their set, you can see that big smile on their face.
Yeah.
They did it, right? And especially when they're learning a brand new move, I
Mhm.
sometimes will see that extremely, it's very apparent because you
Mhm.
go from the first session where they're maybe dysregulated a little bit because the movement is a little hard, or like they're not wanting to because they're not sure what they're expected to do. But then over time, you just see that, as soon as, that fourth or fifth session comes in and that exercise has come up, they're just
Mhm.
like, they know exactly what they need to do. They grab the equipment and they start going, right? And you see that, when they're finished, you see that big smile on their face, or like you just see that they're like, you just don't see those same behaviors as you did that first session. So for me, that's how I measure confidence, right? And just their
Yeah.
ability to just take ownership of the exercise and just know
Right.
exactly what they need to do. And they've done that over time with me. And it doesn't look the same on the first session to when I
Right.
see it in the first, fifth, or sixth session. But you do see that drastic improvement as they're familiarizing with the movement, and that clicks, right? Like where it's like,
Mm.
oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, or this is how it's supposed to feel. So, anyways,
Yeah. And those are definitely like they're legitimate, observable, and replicable aspects
yeah,
of performance also. So they are ultimately measurable. I think, and I agree with what you're saying completely. There are these very obvious components of it. So you can measure latency, for example,
mhm,
and an athlete is much less dysregulated when they're approaching their first set or their second set earlier on in the session also. So you go from session 2 to session 22, and there is a marked decrease in the latency between when you as a coach are giving them, an instruction or prompts, and they're going and completing the exercise.
mhm,
And then there are these other aspects of it, of that self-initiation and even less hesitancy, not with respect to latency necessarily, but less hesitancy in that the athlete has more of a desire to perform that exercise. So they seek it out uh,
yes.
as well. Do you have any examples? Because I love getting into all of our experts and pros, particular athletes. Do you have an athlete or a session that really stands out as one of those reminders of how far, you've come as a coach and how far that athlete has come in their program?
Yeah, I have few actually because I've been working with few for a few months now, and um, the one that I think particularly stands out, uh, I remember our first session
Mhm.
where he was negotiating how long he had to do the session
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
He was very, again, just not used to movement, just as part of their regular, session. And I remember the first session, he like, was very much like 30 minutes, like, what do you mean 30 minutes? What do you mean 10 moves? And very articulate, right? Like, and
Yeah.
is able to communicate exactly his displeasure of how long he has to do it for, what he has to do. And we've kind of, and taking feedback was very difficult for him. And I'm sure you've probably worked with athletes where, and a lot of the work that we do, there is some corrective feedback, right? Because we do need to make sure that they're, moving, in the right form, or like at least having some level of good form to prevent injury. And
Yeah.
or like, they have to complete X amount of reps, or they're doing it too fast and they need to slow down. A lot of those aspects he struggled with initially, because, it was something that, and this was not specific to just my session with him, it was just every day, right? Having to redo things, even with schoolwork was difficult for him, like that, and just taking that feedback was very challenging.
Yeah.
And so over time, like we've been together for quite a few months now. And like, as we've built that relationship, as he's sort of like learned the expectation, as we've, we've scaled it down to build that confidence, to build that stamina a little bit over time. Now it's like, he looks forward to sessions when when we start sessions, and I still get some dysregulation, time to time, but I think overall he's come so far in terms of even taking feedback, right? Where I can now correct him without him getting really, really dysregulated and and not take it sort of where he completely talks down to himself and like gets really
Or
down on himself about not being able to do something. Now it's more around, it's just a slight feedback. He takes it, we correct it, and we're able to move on, which has tremendously improved our sort of like his ability to take on new exercises because now it's no longer every exercise is a struggle because I can't correct him. Now he's able to learn a lot more and he's been able to add a lot more new repertoire to his exercises.
yeah,
The biggest thing was really, and I think you've probably seen this with your athletes, where, you know, stairs was quite challenging. Like
mhm,
it was, something that, he absolutely would, lean against the wall, slide down the stairs, didn't have the confidence to go step by step. And now he's doing it sort of like, we've worked through that and he's actually doing it, confidently, and he will actually correct himself midway. I'm like, oh,
mhm,
right. And so that even just like that, the muscle memory of like what he has to do is slowly changing, and we're seeing sort of that overspill
yeah,
to the rest of sort of like even in just like outside of session, right?
mhm,
And yeah, so like his is probably, like I said, from where we were when we first started to where we would almost have to negotiate and like, talk about sessions. Now we're at a point where, he's developed a lot of these other skills that is way beyond even just fitness related, but like that executive functioning skills of like, taking feedback and, planning and resting appropriately. Because we used to also struggle with during rest times, right? He would
mhm.
always struggle to come back after rest, and he would
Right,
always need,
that transitioning. Yeah,
yeah, that transitioning and or needing longer rest. Now we're doing much shorter
right.
rest, things like that. So we've actually gone from, really having 20-minute sessions to now we're having a solid 45 to 50-minute sessions,
Yeah,
which is tremendously amazing for him because he's just been able to just move so much better, right? Like, and we're just able to kind of open up more opportunities for him, even just from that little bit of like working through that feedback piece was huge for us. So,
yeah. You were talking about trust, and this is something that it's one of those, I don't even know if it's a little big thing also, because trust is a big deal, but giving critique feedback to an athlete, and you mentioned also that this particular athlete, and I've had athletes like this also, where if you give something that can be perceived as critical, that athlete will either shut down or, at minimum, it won't be effective. And then it's also feeding into the potential narrative that the athlete isn't doing well and that they don't know how to do it, and all of these things that can certainly, snowball or cascade. And for a very long time, even in the curriculum, I had a challenge of, how do you convey communication when the athlete is not performing the exercise, not even, perfectly or to standard, but not even to their best current ability right now? And the reason what you were just talking about resonates so well is I think we have to earn the right oftentimes to give our athletes, regardless of their functional capabilities, whether we're looking at physical, adaptive, and cognitive, we have to earn the right to give our athletes certain pieces of information. And this is outside the realm of, oh, something is inherently, dangerous and it's
mm-hmm.
an immediate issue. We I think many of us have had those moments where the athlete pulls back, a resistance band and is about to let it go, or they're chucking a medicine ball, something like that, where a direct and appropriate intervention is needed. But even something like, and it seems so almost so much of a non-issue, but it really is something like an athlete pulling on the resistance band when they're doing a row or a pull down too quickly. And
Mhm.
it negates the effectiveness and the training effect of the exercise. So as a coach, we want to intervene and step in, but we oftentimes have to be very careful with the language we choose and the way we approach it. For I think many athletes, it's a question of time and trust, and also that confidence again in knowing that they can do it. And then it gives, I've earned the right to say, hey, slow down a little bit, because hey, slow down a little bit sounds innocuous enough. But if I haven't consistently paired myself with reinforcement and built that trust and paired exercise with reinforcement, if my first interaction with that athlete when they're doing that set of band rows is, hey, slow down, which is so commonplace also with the ASD and neurodivergent population, I'm probably going to have a lot more difficult time developing that trust with them.
Mhm. Hmm. Yeah, I did find that like, and all my athletes are very different, right? Because I feel that corrective feedback can be a little bit of an, can be a bit of a challenge. So
Sure.
I've got to really adapt. And I think that's where like that path profile really comes in because every session is also very different. So I really assess every day, every session that I have with these athletes based on that. So sometimes, they have no problem tolerating, my corrective
Yep.
feedback absolutely no problems at all and we're great, and there are days when us even just looking at them sometimes could really not be very helpful. So I
Sure.
kind of adjust sort of my coaching strategy based on that as well. So even I found really well like with some of my athletes, like instead of just being like, hey, let's slow down there, it's like, hey, that was not bad, let's try, I'm going to challenge you to, let's see if we can slow it down, like, and then use sort of like modeling or any sort of like
Yeah.
cues to be like, okay, just match my tempo, for
Yeah.
example. So again, every athlete's very different, and something that worked this session may not always work the next session, so you kind of have to really adapt that in terms of, yeah, even in terms of feedback, right? Because
Yeah.
you really want to make sure that they're getting the most out of the session, obviously. But at the same time, you don't want it to become, a power struggle where now you're going to get nothing out of that session at all.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've noticed with a few of my athletes also when I'm giving that type of feedback for the first time, like, okay, slow it down, that looked good, and slow the is it's often an issue of perception. So I think the most common verbal feedback that I will get from an athlete, if I say, okay, a little slower, or okay, farther down, or anything that is a precursor to, you know, to dialing into the exercise and doing it, at the risk of saying doing it better, um,
Mhm.
doing it better, and I'll um, I'll encapsulate that also. Doing it better because I know the athlete has that capability because I've seen it before. Not because, oh, if I just say, and I think there's another big difference. You know, can versus can't is a bit. Some athletes, many of our ASD and neurodivergent athletes, do not have the strength and stability to get into that below parallel squat position yet.
Mhm.
They don't have it yet, so we have to be mindful of that. But the most common feedback that I get from some athletes when I'm trying to gently nudge towards doing that better repetition is, I am doing it.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
get I am going slow.
Yep.
I
Yep.
am, and then it's, oh, all right. Well, and then you have to recalibrate a little bit also, because it's what you just said. The last thing that you want is a power struggle or an argument around this exercise that we're doing right now because then we're just, circling the drain
Mhm.
here for this particular set and maybe the session as a whole. But it's that balance between, as a coach and as a professional, providing the athlete with the best possible, training and support, giving them their independence, but also enabling them to achieve
Mhm.
as well.
Mhm.
And it's a balance. And as you mentioned before, that can change minute to minute sometimes.
I know. And like I find like like what I've found really successful is like I'll find one thing, just one thing to sort of focus my attention on tweaking, right? In that set. Because I know it's going to be a long process, right? Like I'm not there, for them to learn the exercise in one session. Like that's something that I've communicated with the families as well. Is like and depending on the athlete, sometimes it might take 5 sessions, sometimes it might take 10, sometimes it only takes one because they're very physically capable and are able. So yeah, like for me, when I'm doing that corrective feedback, I've learned from just coaching is like I pick one thing that I know that I can tweak
Yep.
that, will just make it just that much better and smoother. And then that's what I focus on. And I'm not giving 5 million corrections. I'm not correcting their feet and their arms and their hands
Yep.
and their, just because that's a lot, right? Even just for myself, when I get too many feedback, like you're just like, okay, what am I focusing on? Right. So I just, I pick the one thing that I can correct that I know I can actually make a difference on in that session, and then that has seemed to help in terms of that corrective feedback is like not overloading and just picking one thing, right? Because
Yeah.
it makes a difference still at the end of the
Sure.
day.
Yeah, and one thing at a time. It's not to say that it's always one thing at a time, but it's a really good approach, and it certainly prohibits the overcoaching aspect also. The overcoaching is the biggest one, and that's what I find. And as someone who went through both the pro and the expert certification, how many times do we come back to, the process of eliminating overcoaching? Because there are so many things that we want to say, but we have to measure that against how effective are we going to be in communicating them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. That was my one. The one thing that I've taken away was like, let's just pick one.
Yeah, and even if it's, so foot positioning on a
Mhm.
squat, if an athlete figures out where they need to stand, they're going to be in a better position. Getting, the hands under the chin and the elbows down. Again, if they can do that repeatedly, if they can set up with their feet and set up with their hands and set up with their elbows independently, they are going to be in a much better position, both physically and I would argue cognitively as well, to perform that exercise as best they can right now. So some of these things, I wouldn't necessarily call them ritualistic, but these are habits that we want them to take on, when they're setting up, checking where their feet are, checking where their hands are, and, regripping the band handles or regripping the dumbbells or the sandbag, whatever it is, because I think that's an indication that they are cognizant and conscientious of what they are doing, what they
Mhm.
need to do in order to do it successfully, and being, present with that particular exercise.
Yeah, no, and it's like it shows their intention, right? Like I then know they're attending, right? They're being and then they've retained some of those easy, like not easy, but like at least those little things and little cues, because then that also frees me up to then coach them on some of the other more complex moves, right? So it's a little, yeah. So we one step at a time, right? So once they've gone one thing down pat, that's one less thing that I need to cue them on or like correct, and then I can focus on something else. So um, but no, it's been like I said, like the pack profile is something that, like I said, I use pretty much every session, right? Like it's not as much as we usually do it at the initial start of the like intake or whatnot. I find myself doing that literally every session with my athlete, multiple times sometimes,
Yeah.
because it changes so much
Right.
in a
Yeah.
given session that you sometimes have to. And it's been a great way for us to sort of set them up basically for success, right?
Mhm.
Ensuring that you're kind of, you know, capturing all three of those aspects. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're always assessing also. It never, we have our initial assessment, which is going to give us our baseline metrics. Like, okay, where is this athlete starting with respect to the squat or the carry or the overhead press? We need to know where we're starting in order to create a plan and create some expectations around it also. But you can have an athlete you've been working with for 3 or 4 years, and midway through a set, they stop and stand up and wander, 10 steps away, and all of a sudden we're in assessment mode of, oh, did they get distracted? Are they overheated? What do they need? And it brings it back to what is the most important aspect that we need to be focused on, as a coach, as a provider right now, because what's happening. So, yeah, I joke about it in the curriculum of we're never getting away from the pack profile, but the truth is that we're always, and I think there's the other side of it also. When things are going really, really well, like athlete is focused and engaged, they're doing the exercise at their current, best capability. They understand the expectations. They're able to motor imitate. They're following our label, demo, do, and cue, the modeling. Everything's good. We're still assessing because we want the athlete to progress also, and that's something even for me is easy to forget about sometimes too, is there's always more to do. There's always more to achieve. And even when an athlete is on maintenance, for example, so they're doing pretty much the same exercise program that they've had for a while. We don't need to modify, these 3 or 4 exercises, but they're not ready to progress yet. So we've got to keep it homeostatic. Even then, we're still looking for, can we add, another repetition?
Yep.
What nuanced things can I do to make this even better for that athlete?
No, for sure. Yeah, no, that is 100%. Yeah.
So why do you think, coming back to your, residential experience, and this is a big um, campaign for Autism Fitness right now, is to bring programming into residential facilities. And while you are certainly, unique as a practitioner in the skills and the dedication that you bring, the situation that you were coming from, that residential facility, is certainly not unique in that they didn't previously have any type of fitness program going on. So from your perspective, being in that environment, what or why are the reasons that it continues to go, if not unnoticed, then not not approached in a really strategic way by implementing fitness programs in the residential facility community?
Yeah. And this is just my personal experience, right? So it's not so I think part of it had to do with so there's some individuals that did go to like, a YMCA,
Mhm.
participate sort of in, the group fitness
Sure.
classes that they offered or adaptive fitness classes that they offered.
Mhm.
But the thing that was missing, I think, was a lot of them didn't think that they were capable, or it's
Mhm.
maybe something that they couldn't do. Maybe that's something that they didn't need.
Mhm.
And they thought maybe just, again, I think there was a big difference between like recreation, right? Right, like walking leisurely
Yeah.
around the block or in the park or in the trail compared to strategic strength training or strategic exercises or program, let's say,
Mhm.
that really focused on developing strengths and movement patterns that would really benefit them sort of an everyday with their ADLs, like their activities of daily living, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think a lot of, and that was, I think, the biggest barrier, quite honestly, was that especially some of the individuals that we supported that were more profoundly, that need more sort of like more support than the average. Um, there was some fear of like, can they, like, is this something that they need? Is this
Mm.
something that, they have other goals that they need to work on, like
Mm.
reducing challenging behavior, for example.
Right.
And so fitness became sort of this thing that was never approached.
Mm.
For me, when I look at it, I always assume competence, right?
Yeah.
You want to always assume competence. You always want to, I think it's something that needs to be incorporated into everyone's life. What, like, however small we can do it as.
Mm.
And sometimes you just have to get creative. But you have to assume competence that they are able to do these things. It's just how you program and how you coach might be a little different based on their capability and their cognitive ability and their adaptive ability, their adaptive ability. But
Mm.
quite honestly, like, I think there's just not enough education around how,
Mm.
some of, like, how important some of these little things are and how it can
Yeah.
relate to the everyday daily living stuff, because you don't even think about it until you really think about, oh my gosh, pushing a cart, for example, you need to
Yeah.
be able to have some strength in order to grip the cart to push it.
Yeah.
Pushing some heavy doors, you do need some strength to push those heavy doors, because
Sure.
a lot of the times our staff were doing that for our athletes, right, or the people that we supported, right? They would open the doors for them. They
Yeah.
would push the cart for them when they went grocery shopping. They would carry the laundry basket for them. And for me, I'm just like, well, that's a great opportunity for them to develop some strength, because that's everyday stuff that they should be able to do. And it's so easy to incorporate that in your, everyday things that you do with them. It's
Mm.
just, you don't think about it because I think there's a little bit of a lack of education around how it can really impact their everyday life and their quality of life if we're able to sneak in these little bit of, you know, I guess, like a little focused, strength training, or like a little bit of like training, I guess, if that makes sense, or like any sort of like fitness activity work.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's kind of a combination of conflating or overgeneralizing recreation and fitness. Like saying, oh, well, we walk outside, or,
Yes.
we have this, open free time. So that is the equivalent.
Oh, Eric, I think you went mute.
I did go mute because I always get, so I've started putting my microphone in front of me now, and I always hit it when I'm gesticulating. So I'm trying to speak with my hands down now, which doesn't work out too well. Um, yeah, so it's this conflation of, well, we go outside and they have the opportunity to walk around, so this is exercise, or we threw a ball around the yard the other day, or they had a chance to, hit a balloon or throw a beanbag, ergo, therefore we did exercise. And the other part of it, that I hear you saying, is on the education side, just understanding the impact that when we say exercise, and I've been a lot more careful about this lately, when we talk about strength-based resistance training, which is kind of redundant because when we're talking about resistance training as the main source of exercise, it is going to have carryover to those activities of daily living. However, it needs to be done right. So just looking at any form of exercise is the same thing as looking at any tool in the toolbox. Like you need to approach it the right way if you want specific outcomes.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? Like, and I think there's just not enough individualization either, right? So when they go to these, I love the fact that they're still moving, at least some of them are. But again, that's for individuals that are able to do those things, right? We have a lot of individuals that are, like I said, needing a lot of support,
Mm.
that typically are not going out the same, or are not, participating in those outside activities. And part of it is, and then it just compounds on top of that. And they're not getting the sort of, like, the opportunities. Then when the opportunity arises, then we see dysregulation because they don't have the skills or the ability to do it. So it just kind of is this constant cycle of, like, where we're not seeing any sort of social social, like basically we're just not seeing any improvement, right?
Right.
Or socially significant improvement for this individual and their quality of life. So at least that's what I sort of noticed. We are seeing a little bit more, in like more involvement in terms of like we are seeing a little bit more programming a little bit with some agencies from what I've seen. But it's definitely one of those things. I don't think they have the resources or the expertise to kind of really bring this in. And we all know, like, funding in this sector for especially for adults in the supported living sort of facilities are quite scarce. So I
Sure.
think with everything else on top of it, fitness I find just gets buried to the bottom just because it's
Yeah.
one of those things that they're not thinking about because there's just so many other layers of things that they are more focused on, right?
Sure.
When in fact this could really be a good foundation that would help propel some of those goals, right? Which again, without the knowledge and without the education around it, they don't see, like, it's maybe they don't see it that way yet.
Yeah.
Uh, so hopefully, it's something that hopefully we can get there with.
That's what we're doing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's it's educating so that it does become a priority, because if it's deprioritized or the consideration isn't there for how impactful it can actually be for our
Mhm.
population, then it continues to go ignored, even though there is a detrimental impact. It's just the um I suppose that the connection is not being made between, oh, they're having a lot of difficulties with these things. What would help with that? Well, them getting stronger and more physically able and more confident to do them.
And programs, right, that actually targets that versus like, hey, let's just throw a bunch of exercises together and let
Right.
them do it, but not really coach them through it. Not really, they don't really know what they're doing. Then they do it incorrectly. They hurt themselves. Now they don't want to do it anymore. And exercise just becomes this whole aversive thing that they just don't want to approach anymore.
Right.
So I think there needs to be strategic, and very intentional inclusion of exercise and structured exercise because yes, we can just throw in any sort of exercise in there in their daily activity schedule, but if it's not intentional or there's no purpose to it, it will
Right.
not really derive any results. If anything, it'll just make it that aversive thing that they now have to do that they don't like doing because
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just
No, it needs to be done correctly, and it needs to
exactly
be done with planning and precision and understanding and expertise behind it, which is why we have expert pros like Angela. Angela, thank you so much for jumping on to Pro Interview Series with me today. Where can people find you if they have questions or if they're interested in what you offer?
Yeah, they can just go on my website. So it's www.spectrumstrengthfitness.com.
Hmm.
And just reach me through there. They can send me an email. I'm always really, like I said, fitness is a bit of a passion for me, especially with this population specifically. So if you guys have any questions in terms of how to, especially when it comes to blending in more of those more complex behavior analytic perspectives into fitness and blending those two together, that is where I'll be able to help you with. So,
Thank you again. And for those of you who are interested in bringing autism fitness into your own programs and facilities, you can become an Autism Fitness Certified Pro. Learn more at autismfitness.com. Thank you, everybody, for watching. You can join Autism Fitness every week for the Tuesday training, and we are continuing to lead the movement for movement.